All right, so David gave you the climate story, and my job here is to tell you how the sausage was made and how the sausage is best served. And this is our section called the Climate Data User's Guide. And much of the work has been done by Catherine Hejevich and myself. And we'll start off by talking about the multivariate adaptive constructed analog approach. You heard that both by Phil and David. And this is also referred to as MACA. It's a downscaling approach, and just so that we're all on the same page, downscaling is a means to translate coarse resolution information down to local scales or scales that can be usable. And in this case, we're downscaling climate data, so we're taking climate model output that's on the scale of 100 to 500 kilometers and bringing that down to the scales of 6 kilometers that can be used by the hydrologic modeling, the vegetation modeling groups. These are local scales, tractable scales. There are on the order of around 6 million different ways to downscale climate data. Okay. Each of these methods have their benefits and their blemishes. No method is correct, and it does represent a source of uncertainty. We've done some work and sort of tried to quantify the uncertainty of downscaling, and it ends up being relatively small. We can talk more about that in some detail. MACA is a statistical downscaling approach, and so both David and Phil showed you some of the potential advantages of using a dynamical downscaling approach to resolve additional features through sort of land surface feedbacks and whatnot. So statistical downscaling approaches are somewhat limited in their ability to resolve some of these additional feedbacks, but they are advantageous for developing large data sets. So with our statistical downscaling, we can actually look at this across 20 different models in a relatively efficient fashion. The MACA approach for downscaling has some additional benefits over some of the other methods. One of the questions that was raised earlier was the time scale of which we actually use the climate model output. And in this case, we're actually using daily data from the GCMs, or sub-daily in the case of high and low temperature. So in doing so, what we can actually start to resolve are some of the changes in climate statistics beyond just the means. We can look at the distributions of, say, precipitation. We can look at the distributions of temperature and actually have a more have more fidelity in doing that rather than just looking at mean temperature and disaggregating to daily timescales. So MACA does this. It also can be extended to beyond just temperature and precipitation. David showed you some of those results as well. And I wanted to go to the next slide and hopefully show you a quick animation that I'll talk over. Oops. Okay, we're going to test the speed of downloading here. One of the things that this project initially set out to do was to downscale and produce data. Wow, this is slow. For just the northwestern United States, and as Phil mentioned, we expanded our domain to beyond the Northwest, and with some additional support from the Southeast Climate Science Center, we've now done this for the contiguous United States, as well as the Canadian Columbia River Basin. And so this is a feel for some of the data. It's just 20 days for January year 2046 from the Meroc 5 model, and you're capturing sort of the progression of weather systems as they traverse the United States. So this is actually daily data from the GCM. We're actually resolving some of the characteristics that define Western climate involving orographic effects, rain shadowing, etc. The MACA method actually uses observed patterns in doing that rather than just interpolating data and adding sort of the topography on top of it. Go back to my presentation. Okay. So some of the data products that we've actually put together, David mentioned the 20 models that we've downscaled data for, also the 2 representative concentration pathways. The downscale data actually goes from 1950 to 2100. The 1950 to 2005 period are sort of historical modeled simulations. They're not necessarily 1998 in the real world. It's model world 1998. But this allows you to look at, time slices into the future, not necessarily a specific time slice that we sort of predetermined for you. The variables, as mentioned here, more than just temperature and precipitation. We've also downscaled specific humidity, 10-meter wind speed, downward shortwave radiation. The resolution of the data set is a 6-kilometer grid. You'll hear more about this later. This is a data set produced by Ben Livnev at the University of Washington and colleagues. You'll hear more about that from our hydrologic colleagues. And it's daily timescales. There is some additional data sets that you can learn more about on our website, but I won't focus on those here today. So the most important part of my talk is to take you through some of the things that we have on our website. I did sort of spare you the gory details of the MACA downscaling approach. You can thank me later. Or if you want to learn more about this approach, you can go to our website, and we have quite a bit of information here learning about how the process works. So we walk you through the steps of the downscaling approach for those people who are interested. We also have a number of tools. So there's a set of analyses tools here, and I'll just briefly mention a few of them. A lot of them work in sort of a menu format. So you can go through and you can actually make plots of, say, the change in temperature versus the change in precipitation. You can go and select your time period of interest, and let's just say we want to look at spring temperature and spring precipitation on the same plot. We can do that, and it'll gin up. It will actually bring up. Let's just use the arrow key. Ooh. Okay, we'll use the arrow key here. And it'll bring up plots like this. So these are things that users can go to, and they can actually look at distributions. And this might be useful for sort of getting an idea of the distribution of the models. And as Phil mentioned, you know, if you do have to use a limited set of models, it might be better to use some of the ones that were higher ranked. Okay. But also, when looking at models, and if you're limited to only looking at a few, you know, this might give you an idea of where they fall in the distribution itself. We have other tools here that let you look at some of the maps that David showed you earlier. So these are very much the same maps that he showed you. You can sort of use this menu here, you know, look at, let's just say, spring precipitation. Ooh. Okay. And, you know, look at specific time periods. And the maps are a little bit excessive maybe, but, sorry about that. You can look at maps across the 20 different models if you really want to. This is a bit much. You can look at them in terms of their downscale data, in terms of the raw data. If that's a bit much for you, you can also look at the multi-model average. And with that, that'll let you look at sort of the bigger picture. And in this case, what we can see is this is the 20-model average in terms of change in precipitation, as well as the sort of a measure of model agreement. So out of the total number of 20 models, how many are suggesting an increase in precipitation, for example. In the interest of time, I'll just mention a couple of other tools rather than walk through them. One of the things with downscaling, one question that we typically get asked is whether or not our downscaling approach is actually capturing the sort of the statistics of the historic or training data set. So the training data set, again, that we used is this data set by the University of Washington. And with some of the maps that you can look at here, you can actually examine biases between the historic downscaled period versus the observed training data. And we can actually go through this, and you can look at whether or not the downscaled data set produces too many days of, say, drizzle, and the answer is no, not really. You can look at changes. You can look at how the downscaled data set simulates, say, the top 1% of precipitation days, the wettest 1%. Is it capturing that right or wrong? And then you can also look at changes between the future in terms of the frequency of dry days or the wettest 1% of wet days, and look at how those are manifested in the downscale data set. So those are things you can look at. And then also for people who want to look at time series and look at it sort of a trace of, say, daily temperature from the raw GCM data, how that gets manifested into the downscale data, that's an option as well. In terms of accessing the data, there are several options that we have available. There are ways to download the data in terms of using a thread server, and this allows users to actually subset from our very large database. You can subset data and acquire it through something called a netcdf file. If you don't know where that is, that's okay. You can also download data through ASCII or binary formats. There are other ways to acquire the data. If you are operating in, say, MATLAB or R or some other programming environment and you want to actually access the data without downloading it directly, you can do that through something called OpenDAP. And we have some We have some code on our website that demonstrates how one would do that. If you are interested in acquiring the data in mass and willing to wait for quite a while, we actually have a menu here that allows you to go through and build a menu, basically. I want these files, I want these variables, and then you wait. And you watch the pipes sort of, slowly grind. But that allows you to access that data in that format if it's of interest to you. Okay, let me go back to my presentation here. So what I want to end with are just a few guidelines in terms of how you might want to access and use these data sets. And I think the way that really we should be thinking about these is these are projections, they're not predictions. Do not try to look at what the weather is going to be like on April 17th of 2050. That's not our goal. We're really looking at longer time scales. Do not look at a single year. For example, 2050, if you want to know if that's going to be a wet year or a dry year, probably not a good question, not a good climate question, or even a single decade like the 2050s. The idea probably is to use a 30-year time slice consistent with what we define as climate and examine things from that context. Do not limit your model selection, and I think Phil mentioned this earlier. If you just choose one model, that model might be sort of an outlier. Okay? So we suggest using as many models as possible, and at least 10 to 12 to get a sort of idea of robustness. And then also, we have downscaled data to the training data set of the LIVNEV. We have not downscaled data to your station. Sorry. So if you are trying to compare data from an observed weather station or whatnot, and you bring in downscaled data, even if it's for that exact location, there may be differences. And so the suggestion here is to either compare modeled historic data to modeled projections, okay? Or if you want to, we also suggest comparing observed data to the training data set and understand what the biases are there. And then finally, the projections that we have created are continuous from 1950 to 2100. If you are interested in the near term, with the experiments that we use do not consider sort of the current state of ocean in terms of these decadal experiments. There are a second set of experiments that have been done using the CMIP-5 modeling, and those are not what we have done here. They're more useful for looking at sort of 30-year time slices out into the future. In terms of what we've learned, David mentioned a little bit about comparisons between CMIP-5 and CMIP-3. In the world of downscaling, much of this project was devoted towards creating data rather than sort of doing science, but we have done some experiments looking at downscaling, not 6 million different ways, but maybe 7 or so. And what we have learned is that actually through the downscaling approach, we have decided that it's really important to actually do a joint bias correction of temperature and precipitation. There are a lot of biases in GCMs directly, and if you downscale temperature independent of precipitation, what we find in the Northwest is that the models tend to simulate wet days as being relatively too warm, and that has some undesirable consequences for snowfall in transient watersheds. So we've advanced that in some fronts. Downscaling with daily data does provide some additional outlets for looking at changes in higher order climate metrics, and then it's a lot of data that we've created. The hydrology team has much more, so they'll swamp this. And then finally, we'll just, again, reinforce our website. That's on your handout. And also, we have a listserv for data updates. So with that, I will take questions.
Hi, John. I'm Steve Klein with EPA in Corvallis, and I had a question about downscaling methodology. And the question is there a case to be made for dynamic downscaling to resolve, topographic effect and, rain, snow? In other words, is there a case to be made for that moving forward?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, from the scientific perspective, I think that's the way to go. There's a limited amount of information that we can get. A lot of the driving factors that we use in our statistical downscaling coming from the GCM, that core scale information. And I think the example that Phil and David both showed with some of the snow albedo feedbacks, that might be a really good example in case for doing dynamical downscaling. One caveat with dynamical downscaling is that that data also probably has to be bias corrected as well. It can't be just ingested. It's going to contain some biases. So I think from a scientific perspective, that's the way to go. Currently I think we're limited in terms of running dynamically downscaled models across 20 different GCMs in a 10-year period. Or from an economic perspective, it's much more efficient to do the statistical downscaling if we want to look at a broad simulation of models.
Thank you.
Lori Hennings, Metro. I was thinking about land cover and wondering whether land cover is, and I don't think it could be, incorporated into the models. And if it's not, what are the implications of that? I'm thinking forest cover, urban.
Yeah, absolutely not. I mean, in terms of changes in land cover and how that might influence climate and feedback to climate, those are not part of the downscaling approach. And that's where, if you did have a sort of a coupled regional model with a land surface model, and it's able to simulate realistic changes in the dynamic vegetation, you might get something out of that. But those are certain uncertainties that we're not resolving with our statistical downscaling approach.
We didn't mention that the RCPs do include land use and land cover change as part of the future scenarios. Now, it's not a dynamical response. The vegetation isn't changing in response to the changing climate, but population growth in more urban areas, conversion of forest to ag is part of, so that's actually built into the scenarios, and many of the models have that as part of on the GCM level. So I just wanted to make that clear.
Yeah, I was just going to loop back on the discussion on dynamical downscaling. So, and I've been involved a little bit in this. There's an attempt to get something off the ground to do regional downscaling with the AR5 models, the ones that we're using in this statistical downscaling exercise, through something called Cordex. And to be perfectly honest, that hasn't gotten a lot of traction. So with the potential funding agencies, the issue is, I mean, Phil and others can tell you what the budget for this effort was, which is downscaling basically western U.S. and, in fact, for John's stuff, the entire U.S. for all his models, okay? It's in the sort of hundreds of thousands of dollars, I can tell you that. To do dynamical downscaling, there was an exercise called NARCAP, which was probably the best designed, in my mind, attempt to go do regional downscaling across the continental U.S., and that exercise was sort of in the millions of dollars, and it got some subset, I think 6 GCMs and 6 regional climate models. 4 GCMs, 6, yeah, 4 times 6 I guess was 24, and it's a matrix which has got a density of like half or something. In any event, that was a major effort that went on for years, and the federal agencies that are potentially in the position to go fund an update to that have been reticent to go fund another effort along those lines. There's certainly, from a scientific standpoint, there's some very good reasons for wanting to do dynamical downscaling, but it's not, I mean, you're talking orders of magnitude difference in terms of the level of effort, funding, and all the rest to do that, so it's sort of a complicated issue from that standpoint.
Hi, John. David Bihar, San Francisco PUC. I'd suggest to Dennis that if we had a project design that was going to capture this audience and the audiences that sometimes Phil and, well, actually frequently Phil and others work with, that Cordex would get funded. But anyway, John, if you take 3 decades and you look at the mean, even if it's multi-model, what are you getting these days out of in terms of understanding extremes, particularly drought?
Particularly drought.
Dry extremes, yeah.
What kind of drought?
Dry drought. I don't know.
Dry
whatever kind of drought you think. I mean, one of the questions that people in this room and people in my community and the water community are asking is what is the droughtiness of the future going to look like? Not from 2051 to 2058 it'll be dry, but you know what I mean. I mean, how are we getting an understanding of extremes quantitatively out of GCMs downscaled with your tool?
Yeah, good question. So we can maybe think about hydrologic drought in terms of sort of very, very poor water year or back-to-back water years, or California's got that going right now. So one of the things that worked with David, Phil, and others when we actually evaluated some of the GCMs is that we found that in the Northwest they tended to underrepresent variability in precipitation in terms of on an annual time scale, multi-annual. And when we actually downscale, we can correct some of those biases, especially if the biases are manifested in terms of seasonal precipitation. But some of the biases cannot be corrected with statistical downscaling. And the biases that I think cannot be corrected with statistical downscaling tend to do with the autocorrelation of the system, or serial correlation. So GCMs that are underrepresenting variability in precipitation, those are going to be sort of challenged. Now we can compare drought in modeled historical versus drought in projected conditions. And with those, and I haven't looked at that per se, but you would be able to. We have looked at sort of shorter time scales in terms of changes in number or consecutive dry days, and those may be more relevant for, say, wildfire, sort of those time scales. But in terms of the sort of lower frequency drought, those are things that I think require us to look at a little bit more detail in terms of the GCMs themselves. Not all GCMs are created equal, and some of the approaches to downscaling are ultimately going to be victim to having the GCM represent the processes correctly.
Yeah, hi, Howard Schaller, Fish and Wildlife Service again. Question I have is on your MACA tools. So you said something very interesting, and that is, particularly like we're looking at vulnerability of species. If we're trying to contrast, what the future looks like to what it looked like historically, the best way to look at this from these projections is really to compare it to the historic model projections. So I guess my question is, and we'll learn more about the hydrological side because I'm more interested in fish, but say for temperature and precip, with the tools, can we select certain areas like a river basin and get the historic information and then say these projections for an ensemble or an average of models, mid-century, end of century?
When you say historic, are you saying observed or historic modeled?
Historic modeling, because that's what you recommended.
That's correct.
Was really to compare this with the historic modeling, because having gone through lots of historic temperature and precip data, you really can't compare it. So that makes sense to me, but what I'm trying to figure out from the tools, is that easily accessible?
Yeah, so you can go in and select a certain latitude, longitude box and be able to extract the data. I think right now the data that we have that are able to be extracted are daily data. Is that right, Catherine? But one thing that we could do is we could aggregate the data to monthly for different users, because I would understand, maybe not wanting the daily data, and if that could save people a step, that's fairly simple to do on our end in terms of creating the files.
You said a certain latitude, longitude box. Is there capability of having some kind of like a polygon shape extracted that way?
Not on what we have currently. I believe that the data will be imported into I think it's called the CEDA. Somebody know what that is? The USGS Climate Data Portal. And with that actually allows you to develop your own polygon, or I think even upload a shapefile and do some aerial weighting average from that, and actually then have that data be imported by yourself. So I think that's one of the goals, but we might have another comment here on that too.
This is Adrienne Wooten in the North Carolina Climate Office in the Southeast Climate Science Center. A couple of things. First off, it's the USGS geodata portal, and you're correct. You can do things with the shape files and the like, which is very powerful. My kind of a question with MACA actually is why the choice of variables actually? Because I was curious, was that more of what everybody else in the team was talking about, thinking about the whole discussion before of coordinated scenarios and the like? Was the choice of variables more for simplicity's sake, or was it more because of the other groups in this team who were going to be using them? Was that what they were most interested in, and hence we were going with those particular variables?
Yeah, I think that these are the general surface meteorological variables that are needed by hydrologic modeling, vegetation modeling. And there are a couple other variables that we didn't show that were produced sort of in tangent with this that get at like diurnal relative humidity and wind velocity, and those were produced outside of the CFC funding, but those were needed by sort of the fire modeling groups. But yes, in general, that's where that coordination came in. There are efforts, there certainly prior to getting downscaled, for example, wind or downscaled shortwave radiation, there are ways to take diurnal temperature and other variables and use approaches to derive those variables. And this gets at an alternative method of doing that.
Bill Pasteris with CH2M again. John, this is an excellent environment that you've created with your colleagues. I'm really impressed, so thank you very much. It appears that you use PRISM for some of your background climatology, which is, I guess that's true, right?
Yeah, the data set by Ben Livnev and colleagues, I believe, uses PRISM to get at the precipitation. Is that right? Yeah. So that the precipitation background, that's sort of got the PRISM in it.
And then another follow-up question here on the daily GCM output. Did you do any censoring of the precip to eliminate the drizzle factor that you're seeing? And a follow-up on that is, could you tighten that a little bit, extend it higher to actually get a signal on drought? Because that might give you a threshold where you have an extended drought. Have you thought about doing some of that?
Yeah, so one thing is that the GCMs do tend to, because of their core scale, you can imagine if you were just to take precipitation, observed precipitation and aggregate it up, you're going to get probably a lot of days with small amounts, but when you average it up, you're going to get that in there. So in our downscaling approach, we actually bias correct the GCM precipitation to begin with, and that by and large reduces some of the problem with drizzle in there. And in our downscaling, when you look at the historical downscale versus the training data, basically we have the same statistics, the right number of dry days, et cetera. The sequences might be different, and that sort of is coming from the GCMs.
And then my final question here is there any definition of how you ranked the metrics that were used to rank the models? Because that's been mentioned several times today. Is that somewhere on the ACRI websites or whatever?
Yeah, the ranking that we did, and I'll mention this briefly, was done using the raw GCM data. And so we wanted to look at sort of, the original data and rank the models themselves. When we downscale, we try to correct for a lot of these blemishes or warts in the GCMs themselves. And we can correct for quite a few of them. And there's an additional effort by Megan Dalton to look at how the downscale data, sort of ranking the downscale data for certain metrics. And what we find in general is that the downscale data does a decent job for quite a few things, but some of the things involving the sequences, the number of dry days in a row, for example, we may not get those correct in terms of the downscaling, and that's coming from the GCM. If the GCM is, we're not going to make it rain on one day just to make it match. So that's coming from the GCM itself.